Imagine waking up and realizing you have no idea where you are. The trees around you look identical in every direction. Your GPS is dead. Your radio is dead. And the jungle is so thick that even screaming at the top of your lungs produces nothing but a muffled echo that dies within seconds. Now imagine that this isn't a nightmare you can wake up from. This is your reality, and you're standing in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, one of the most hostile environments on planet Earth. Every direction looks the same. Every sound could be salvation or death. And the people searching for you are flying overhead, but they can't see you through the canopy. They're so close yet impossibly far away. This is what happened to David Marchetti, a wildlife photographer who went into the jungle for what should have been a simple 2-hour photography session. What followed was a 12-day ordeal that tested every ounce of his physical strength, mental resilience, and will to survive. He would face jaguars circling his camp at night, torrential rains that lasted 16 hours straight, an injury that nearly ended his journey, and perhaps worst of all, the crushing psychological weight of complete isolation in a place where nature doesn't just ignore you, it actively tries to break you down. This is his story. The Amazon rainforest stretches across 2.1 million square miles of South America, covering roughly 40% of the entire continent. It's home to 10% of all species on Earth, more than 400 billion individual trees, rivers that move more water than any others on the planet. But statistics don't capture what it's actually like to be there, deep in the primary forest where humans rarely venture. The canopy overhead is so dense that even at midday, only about 2% of sunlight reaches the forest floor. The humidity sits at a constant 88%, creating an atmosphere that feels more like breathing water than air. The temperature hovers around 80 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, but the humidity makes it feel 20 degrees hotter. And the sounds, the constant, overwhelming symphony of life and death happening all around you, create a sensory experience unlike anywhere else on Earth. For indigenous peoples who have lived there for thousands of years, the Amazon is home. They understand its rhythms, its dangers, its gifts. But for outsiders, even experienced ones, the Amazon is a place that demands absolute respect. One mistake can be fatal. David Marchetti grew up in Boulder, Colorado, surrounded by mountains but dreaming of jungles. His father was a geology professor at the University of Colorado. His mother taught high school biology. Both instilled in him a deep appreciation for the natural world and a curiosity that bordered on obsession. As a child, David spent his summers hiking the Rockies with his father, learning to read maps, use a compass, and respect the power of wilderness. By the time he was 16, he'd climbed 14 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. By 20, he developed a passion for photography that would define his adult life. After graduating from the University of Colorado with a degree in environmental science, David spent his early 20s working odd jobs while building his photography portfolio. He photographed everything from local wildlife to mountain landscapes, slowly improving his craft. His big break came at age 27 when National Geographic purchased a series of his photos documenting the effects of climate change on Colorado's alpine ecosystems. The check wasn't huge, but the credibility was priceless. Suddenly, David Marchetti wasn't just another freelance photographer. He was someone whose work appeared in one of the world's most prestigious publications. Over the next 7 years, David built a reputation as someone willing to go anywhere for the perfect shot. He spent 3 months in Antarctica documenting penguin colonies, 6 weeks in the Sahara capturing images of desert-adapted wildlife, 2 months above the Arctic Circle in Canada photographing polar bears. Each expedition pushed him further, tested him more, taught him lessons about survival and preparation. He developed systems, checklists, redundancies. He never relied on a single piece of equipment. He always carried backup batteries, backup cameras, backup everything. His meticulous nature had saved him more than once when equipment failed in extreme conditions. But the Amazon had always eluded him. It wasn't for lack of interest. David had been fascinated by rainforest ecosystems since childhood. He'd read everything he could about the Amazon, watched countless documentaries, studied the work of photographers he admired who'd worked there. But opportunities to photograph in the deep Amazon, away from tourist areas and lodges, were rare. Research expeditions typically didn't welcome photographers. They were focused on science, and outsiders were often seen as distractions. So when David received an email in March 2019 from Dr. Maria Santos, a Brazilian ecologist he'd met at a conference 2 years earlier, asking if he'd be interested in joining a research expedition to study poison dart frogs in a remote section of the Amazon basin, he didn't hesitate. He said yes within an hour. The expedition was scheduled for May which meant David had 2 months to prepare. He researched extensively. The area they'd be working in was about 150 miles southwest of Manaus, in a region where the Rio Negro and several smaller tributaries created a maze of waterways cutting through primary rainforest. Primary forest, as opposed to secondary forest that has regrown after clearing, is the oldest, densest, most biologically diverse type of rainforest. It's also the most challenging to navigate. There are no trails, no clearings, just endless trees, vines, and undergrowth that can take hours to cross even short distances. David purchased new equipment specifically for the expedition. A satellite communicator that was supposedly waterproof to 50 feet. A GPS unit with a battery life of 25 hours. A compact DSLR camera with weather sealing rated for extreme humidity. Multiple sets of quick-dry clothing. A lightweight hammock with a mosquito net. Water purification tablets. A comprehensive first aid kit. He even took a wilderness first responder course to brush up on his medical knowledge. By the time he boarded his flight to Manaus on May 10th, David felt more prepared than he'd ever been for any expedition. The flight from Denver to Manaus took 15 hours with a connection in Panama City. David spent most of it reviewing his equipment list and reading research papers about the specific frog species Dr. Santos was studying. The Amazonian poison dart frog, Ranitomia amazonica, was a small amphibian whose bright coloration warned predators of its toxic skin secretions. Dr. Santos had been studying these frogs for 6 years, trying to understand how climate change and habitat fragmentation affected their populations. It was important work, but David wasn't there for the frogs. He was there for the forest itself. The chance to capture images of primary Amazon rainforest, the kind of pristine wilderness that was disappearing at an alarming rate. Manaus hit David like a physical force when he stepped off the plane. The heat, the humidity, the smell of the city, a mix of diesel fuel, grilled meat, and the ever-present dampness that permeated everything. Manaus is a city of over 2 million people dropped into the middle of the Amazon. It exists because of the rubber boom of the late 1800s, when the region supplied most of the world's rubber before plantations in Southeast Asia took over. Now it's a major port and industrial center, but it's still surrounded by thousands of miles of rainforest in every direction. David spent 2 days in Manaus acclimating and meeting the rest of the team. Dr. Maria Santos was in her mid-40s, compact and energetic, with the kind of intensity that comes from dedicating your life to a single question. She'd spent more time in the Amazon than most indigenous people, logging over 3,000 days in the field over her career. Her research assistant, Paulo, was a graduate student from Sao Paulo, 26 years old and experiencing the deep Amazon for the first time. The 2 local guides, João and Rafael, were brothers from a small community along the Rio Negro. Both had grown up in the forest. João was 42, Rafael 38. They spoke limited English but communicated perfectly in the international language of competent outdoorsmen who know their environment intimately. On May 13th, the team loaded their equipment into 2 motorized canoes and headed upriver. The journey from Manaus to their field site took 8 hours, moving against the current on increasingly narrow tributaries. The further they went, the more the forest closed in around them. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the sounds of the jungle. Howler monkeys announced their territory with roars that sounded impossibly loud for animals weighing only 15 pounds. Parrots and macaws flew overhead in pairs. Caimans, small South American crocodilians, sunned themselves on muddy banks. By late afternoon, they reached the field site. It wasn't much. A small clearing barely large enough for their tents, about 30 feet from the water's edge. The guides had been here before and had set up a basic camp structure. A covered area for cooking and gear storage and cleared spaces for sleeping tents. Dr. Santos, Paulo, and David each had their own tent. The guides shared one. That first night, David lay in his hammock inside his tent, listening to the jungle come alive after dark. The sounds were overwhelming. Insects created a constant high-pitched drone. Frogs called in dozens of different tones. Something large moved through the forest nearby, cracking branches. In the distance, a jaguar made its distinctive sawing roar. David had trouble sleeping, but it was the good kind of trouble. The excitement of being exactly where he wanted to be. The team fell into a routine over the next 24 hours. Dr. Santos and Paulo spent their days searching for frogs, taking measurements, collecting data. The guides maintained camp, prepared meals, and occasionally ventured out to fish or gather specific plants they used for various purposes. David explored the immediate area around camp, never going more than a few hundred yards in any direction, taking photographs of everything he encountered. The biodiversity was staggering. In a single morning, he photographed 17 different bird species, 5 different types of butterflies, and countless insects he couldn't identify. On the morning of May 14th, David approached Dr. Santos with a request. He'd heard from the guides that there was a specific area about 2 miles north of camp where scarlet macaws had been nesting. These birds, with their brilliant red, yellow, and blue plumage, were among the most spectacular in the Amazon. David had photographed macaws in captivity and at tourist lodges, but never truly wild ones in primary forest. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd come for. Dr. Santos hesitated. 2 miles doesn't sound far, but in dense rainforest, it could take 3 hours to cover that distance. And they were in a remote area with limited communication. Their satellite phone worked, but only in clearings where it could get a signal through the canopy. Still, David was experienced. He had his GPS, his satellite communicator, water, basic supplies, and most importantly, he understood the risks. After discussing it with Joao and Rafael, who confirmed they knew the general area David was talking about, Dr. Santos agreed with one firm condition: be back by 3 p.m. If he wasn't back by then, they'd start searching. David set out at 7:30 a.m. on May 14th. The temperature was already approaching 80 degrees, but under the canopy it felt much hotter. The humidity was so thick that his clothes were soaked with sweat within 10 minutes. He followed a game trail heading roughly north, checking his GPS every few hundred yards to track his progress. The trail wasn't really a trail in the traditional sense. It was just an area where the undergrowth was slightly less dense, probably used by peccaries or tapirs. David moved slowly, both because the terrain demanded it and because he was constantly scanning for photographic opportunities. He photographed a magnificent morpho butterfly, its wings electric blue in a shaft of sunlight. A 3-toed sloth hanging motionless from a branch 60 feet up. Leafcutter ants marching in a line hundreds of yards long, each carrying a piece of leaf several times its size. By 9 a.m., David had covered about 1.5 miles. His GPS showed he was close to the area where the macaws had been spotted. He stopped to drink water and eat an energy bar. The forest around him was alive with sound. Birds called. Insects buzzed. Somewhere in the canopy, monkeys crashed through branches. And then he heard it. The distinctive, harsh call of a macaw. He moved toward the sound, slowly and carefully. Photography requires patience, something David had learned early in his career. You don't chase wildlife. You position yourself and wait for it to come to you, or for the right light, or for the perfect moment. It took another 30 minutes of careful movement before David spotted them. A pair of scarlet macaws perched on a branch about 40 feet up. They were magnificent. Their red plumage seemed to glow even in the filtered light under the canopy. Yellow wing patches flashed when they moved. Their powerful beaks worked at something he couldn't quite see, probably seeds or nuts. David found a position with a relatively clear line of sight and started shooting. He used a long lens, 400 millimeters, which allowed him to fill the frame with the birds while maintaining enough distance not to disturb them. The light was challenging. Deep shadow contrasted with occasional bright patches where sunlight penetrated the canopy. David bracketed his exposures, taking multiple shots at different settings to ensure he captured the full dynamic range. He spent nearly 1 hour and 15 minutes photographing those macaws. It was exactly the kind of patient, focused work that separated professional wildlife photography from amateur snapshot taking. The birds eventually flew off, and David checked his images on his camera's LCD screen. They were spectacular. Sharp focus, good exposure. The vibrant colors captured perfectly. This alone made the entire expedition worthwhile. He checked his watch. 10:30 a.m. Plenty of time to get back before the 3 p.m. deadline. That's when David reached into his pack for his GPS to begin the return journey. The device felt warm, which was normal in the Amazon heat. But when he pressed the power button, the screen flickered once and went dark. He pressed it again. Nothing. He held down the power button for 10 seconds, attempting a reset. The screen remained black. David felt his first spike of real concern. He pulled out his satellite communicator. Same result. Dead. Completely unresponsive. He checked both devices more carefully and realized what had happened. Despite being supposedly waterproof, the constant humidity and his own sweat had penetrated the seals. Condensation had formed inside both units. They were fried. David took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. Panic kills. That was one of the first lessons of wilderness survival. Panic makes you do stupid things, waste energy, make bad decisions. He still had his compass. He'd come from the south, which meant camp was south. Simple geometry. He just needed to walk south for about 2 miles, maybe a bit more given how much he'd zigzagged following the birds. He had water. He had his whistle for signaling. He had basic supplies. This was manageable. Just a minor equipment failure and a navigational challenge. He dealt with worse. David pulled out his compass and took a bearing. He marked a tree in his line of sight and started walking toward it, planning to take another bearing once he reached it. This was basic orienteering, something he'd learned as a teenager. The problem, which David would fully understand soon, was that the Amazon doesn't allow straight-line travel. Every few feet something blocks your path. A fallen tree, a dense patch of undergrowth, a massive root system. You constantly detour around obstacles, and even with a compass, maintaining a true course is nearly impossible. After what David estimated was about 30 minutes of walking, he stopped to rest and take another bearing, still pointing south. Good. He blew his whistle 3 times, the international signal for distress. The sound seemed to die almost instantly, swallowed by the dense vegetation and humid air. He waited. Listen. Nothing but the ambient sounds of the forest. He continued south. The terrain was exhausting. He climbed over logs, pushed through dense ferns, waded through ankle-deep water in low spots. His progress was slow. Much slower than the journey out when he'd been following a game trail and taking his time. Now he was trying to move quickly in a straight line, which paradoxically made travel more difficult. By 11:45 a.m., David stopped again. He should have covered at least a mile by now, probably more. He should be getting close to camp. He listened intently for any human sounds. The camp generator they used to charge equipment. Voices. Metal hitting wood. Anything. He heard nothing but jungle. He blew his whistle again. 3 long blasts. Waited. Nothing. A small knot of worry was forming in his stomach. He checked his compass, confirmed he was still heading south, and kept moving. At 1 p.m., David knew something was seriously wrong. He should have reached camp by now. Even if he'd gotten turned around slightly, even if his distance estimates were off, he should have hit the river. The camp was only about 30 feet from the water's edge. A river, even a small tributary, is impossible to miss. You hear it long before you see it. But David heard nothing except forest sounds. He tried climbing a tree to get a better vantage point. Finding a climbable tree in the rainforest isn't easy. Most have smooth trunks with no branches until 40 or 50 feet up. He finally found one with enough branches and handholds to manage an ascent. It took him 20 minutes to climb about 45 feet, high enough to see over some of the lower canopy. What David saw was terrifying in its monotony. Green. In every single direction as far as he could see, nothing but the undulating green canopy of the rainforest. No clearing, no river, no break in the vegetation whatsoever. He could see maybe a half mile in good directions, less where the canopy was particularly dense. There was nothing that distinguished any direction from any other. He might as well have been in the middle of an ocean, surrounded by water in every direction with no land in sight. The scale of his situation hit him then. He was alone in an area of roughly 2 million square miles of rainforest. Finding him would be like finding a single ant in a city. The odds were astronomical. David climbed down and sat with his back against the tree. This was the moment when David Marchetti truly understood that he was lost in the Amazon rainforest. Making the decision to stay put was probably what saved David's life. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to find camp, to get back to safety. But he remembered his training. The first rule when lost: stop moving. Let the rescue come to you. He knew Dr. Santos would raise the alarm when he didn't return by 3 p.m. She'd organize a search. They'd use boats to cover the river. The guides knew the area. They'd find him. But only if he stayed in one place and made himself as visible and audible as possible. Moving would just take him further from where they expected him to be. David found a relatively flat area beneath an enormous kapok tree. These trees are among the giants of the Amazon, often reaching 150 feet tall with buttress roots that spread out like walls. The roots created a natural shelter of sorts, and the massive trunk would protect him from wind and rain. It was as good a spot as any to wait for rescue. He checked his supplies systematically. 1 liter of water, about half remaining. 1 granola bar. 1 protein bar. A small first aid kit with bandages, antibiotic ointment, pain relievers, and water purification tablets. A lighter. A good quality pocket knife. 50 feet of paracord. A small tarp, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet. His camera equipment, now functionally useless except for taking pictures. The clothes on his back, already soaked with sweat and humidity. A whistle. No tent. no sleeping bag, no real food beyond those 2 bars, no water filter or purification system beyond the tablets. There wasn't much. David's first priority was water. He had maybe half a liter left, enough for a few hours in this heat. He could hear water nearby, the sound of a small stream moving over rocks. He found it about 50 yards from his chosen camp spot. The water was clear and moving, both good signs. Standing water in the Amazon is dangerous, full of parasites and bacteria. Moving water is safer, though far from guaranteed safe. David filled his bottle and dropped in 2 purification tablets. The tablets took 30 minutes to work and would kill most bacteria and viruses, though not all parasites. It was better than nothing. His second priority was shelter. The sun was past its zenith, which meant he had maybe 5 hours until dark. Darkness comes quickly at the equator. There's very little twilight. One moment it's light, 15 minutes later it's full dark. David strung his tarp between 2 trees using the paracord, creating a basic lean-to shelter. It wasn't fancy, but it would provide some protection from rain and keep him slightly drier than being fully exposed. The ground beneath was damp, but everything in the Amazon is damp. He gathered broad leaves to create a slight barrier between himself and the wet earth. It would help, but not much. His third priority was fire. Fire serves multiple purposes in a survival situation. It provides warmth, though that wasn't a major concern in the Amazon heat. It purifies water through boiling. It keeps animals away. It provides psychological comfort. And most importantly for David's situation, it creates smoke that rescuers can see. Building a fire in the Amazon is challenging. Everything is damp. Wood that looks dry on the outside is often wet inside. David spent the next hour gathering materials. He looked for dead wood that was still standing or hanging, as it would be drier than anything on the ground. He found some bamboo-like plants that had dried sections. He gathered dry moss from the underside of fallen logs. He created a nest of tinder, then built a small teepee structure of progressively larger sticks around it. The lighter worked. Small miracle. David had kept it in a waterproof case deep in his pack, and unlike his electronics, it had stayed functional. The tinder caught. He blew gently, adding oxygen. The flame grew. Tiny sticks caught. Slightly larger ones. Within 15 minutes, he had a small but sustainable fire. He added green leaves to create smoke, hoping against hope that someone would see it. But the canopy above was so thick that most of the smoke just spread out horizontally rather than rising above the trees. Still, it was something. By the time David finished setting up his basic camp, it was after 4 p.m. Dr. Santos would have raised the alarm an hour ago. They'd be looking for him. David blew his whistle every 10 minutes. 3 sharp blasts. The international distress signal. He listened intently between whistles. Nothing. He shouted until his throat was raw. The sound carried poorly in the dense forest, absorbed by vegetation and humidity. At 6:30 p.m. the sun set. Within 15 minutes, full darkness descended. The Amazon at night is a different world. The daytime cacophony of birds and monkeys is replaced by a different orchestra. Frogs begin their chorus, hundreds of different species creating a sound so loud it's almost overwhelming. Insects buzz and click and hum. Things rustle in the undergrowth. Larger animals move through the darkness, their presence announced by breaking branches and heavy footfalls. David fed his fire steadily, keeping it going more for psychological comfort than warmth. The flames created a circle of light about 15 feet across. Beyond that was absolute darkness. Not the darkness of a moonlit night in familiar woods, but the complete absence of light that exists under a triple canopy in the tropics. David had a small LED flashlight, but he was conserving the batteries. He used it sparingly only when absolutely necessary. Around 9 p.m., David heard something large approaching his camp. Something big enough to make noise despite moving slowly. He threw more wood on the fire, making the flames leap higher. He gripped his knife, though he knew it would be useless against a jaguar or puma. The animal circled his camp. He could hear it moving, could hear brush being pushed aside. It stayed just beyond the firelight. David yelled at it, trying to sound aggressive and threatening. The animal stopped, waited, then slowly moved away. David didn't sleep that night. Every time he dozed off, a sound would jerk him awake. His imagination, fueled by fear and darkness, turned every noise into a threat. He kept the fire burning through the night, adding wood whenever it started to die down. When dawn finally broke, around 6 a.m., David felt exhausted but relieved to have survived the night. He'd learned an important lesson. Nighttime in the Amazon is when survival becomes most psychological. The physical challenges are constant. But at night, your mind becomes your worst enemy. He rationed his food carefully, eating half of his granola bar for breakfast. He purified more water from the stream. He checked his shelter and reinforced areas where the tarp was sagging. He gathered more firewood, knowing he'd need a good supply for the next night. And he waited. He blew his whistle every 30 minutes. He kept his fire smoking as much as possible. He shouted periodically. He made noise, trying to make himself as detectable as possible. The hours crawled by. David tried to stay occupied. He attempted to fish in the stream using paracord and a hook fashioned from a safety pin in his first aid kit. He had no luck. He looked for edible plants but found nothing he was confident identifying. The Amazon is full of fruits, nuts, and edible plants, but it's also full of things that will make you violently ill or kill you. Without proper knowledge, foraging is dangerous. David decided hunger was preferable to poisoning. He photographed the forest around him, not for any practical reason but because it gave him something to do. Keeping busy, keeping his mind occupied was crucial. Boredom and despair are as dangerous as any physical threat in a survival situation. Around 2 p.m. on his second day, David heard it. The unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Distant but definitely a helicopter. His heart leaped. They were searching for him. He ran to the most open area he could find, a small gap in the canopy about 20 feet across. He used his camera's flash, firing it repeatedly upward. He screamed. He blew his whistle until he thought his lungs would burst. The helicopter's sound grew louder. It was getting closer. David could see nothing through the canopy, but the sound was there, real and getting stronger. He kept flashing his camera, kept blowing his whistle, and then the sound started to fade. The helicopter was moving away. They hadn't seen him. David sat down hard on the wet ground. For the first time since getting lost, he cried. Not from fear, but from sheer frustration. They were so close, maybe 500 feet above him. But the canopy was too thick. From the air, the forest looked like an unbroken carpet of green. He was invisible. That helicopter might have been right over him and never known. The cruelty of being so close to rescue yet so impossibly far devastated him emotionally. He sat there for probably 20 minutes, just letting the disappointment wash over him. Then he forced himself to stand up, return to camp, and continue surviving. He had no other choice. Day 3 brought rain. Not the gentle rain of temperate climates, but Amazonian rain. It started around 10 a.m. with barely any warning. One moment the forest was its normal damp self. The next, water was pouring from the sky like someone had turned on a fire hose. The sound was deafening. Rain hitting leaves created a roar that made hearing anything else impossible. Within seconds, David was soaked completely through. His shelter, barely adequate in dry conditions, became useless. Water poured through the tarp. The fire went out instantly, hissing and smoking. Everything got wet. His clothes, his equipment, the firewood he'd carefully gathered. The rain was warm, but being constantly wet was more than uncomfortable. It was dangerous. The rain continued for 16 hours. David huddled under his tarp, which provided psychological more than actual protection. Water pooled everywhere. The ground turned to mud. Small streams formed where none had been before. The forest, usually green and shadowy, became gray and dim. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet. The rain was so heavy that it created a kind of fog, water vapor mixing with water droplets. David had never experienced anything like it. He tried to keep his most important items dry, but it was impossible. Everything was wet. His lighter stopped working. His spare clothes were soaked. Even his supposedly waterproof pack had water inside. When the rain finally stopped, around 2 a.m., David was shivering despite the fact that the temperature was still in the mid-70s. Constant wetness leaches body heat. More importantly, it destroys morale. Being wet is miserable in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it for extended periods. Your skin starts to break down. Small cuts and scratches that would normally be minor become infected easily. Rashes develop. Fungal infections flourish. The constant dampness creates an environment where the human body struggles to maintain its integrity. David spent the hours after the rain trying to restart his fire. His lighter wouldn't work no matter what he tried. The button clicked but produced no spark. He tried to dry it out, but everything was too wet. Finally, he remembered a technique his father had taught him years ago. He took apart the lighter and used the flint wheel and his knife to create sparks. It took him nearly 2 hours, but eventually he got enough sparks to ignite some dry tinder he'd found deep inside a rotting log where moisture hadn't fully penetrated. The small flame grew. David nearly cried with relief when the fire caught. He carefully built it up, feeding it progressively larger pieces of wood that he held near the flames to dry before adding them. By dawn, he had a sustainable fire going again. Food was becoming a serious problem. David had eaten his last protein bar on day 2. He was now running on empty. Hunger is a strange thing. The first day or two it's uncomfortable. Your stomach growls. You think about food constantly. But after about 72 hours, the acute hunger fades. It's replaced by a different sensation. A hollow weakness, difficulty concentrating, dizziness when standing up quickly. Your body is beginning to consume itself, breaking down muscle tissue for energy. David knew he was entering dangerous territory. He needed calories. He tried eating some berries that looked safe. They were small, red, and birds had been eating them, which was usually a good sign. What works for birds doesn't always work for humans. Within 3 hours, David was experiencing violent cramping and diarrhea. He spent most of day 4 close to camp, too sick and weak to do much else. The diarrhea was dangerous not just because it was miserable, but because it dehydrated him. He had to drink much more water than normal, which meant more trips to the stream, more energy expenditure. By the end of day 4, David had lost noticeable weight. His face was gaunt. His clothes hung looser. His belt, already tightened to its last hole, needed to be tightened further. He used his knife to punch a new hole. Days 5, 6, and 7 blurred together in David's memory. They formed a continuous block of time characterized by routine, discomfort, and creeping despair. He established a daily schedule that gave structure to his existence. Wake at dawn. Rebuild the fire. Drink water. Blow whistle every 30 minutes. Gather firewood. Attempt to find food. Rest during the hottest part of the day. Gather more firewood. Prepare for night. Maintain fire through darkness. The routine was important. It gave him tasks, kept his mind occupied, prevented him from spiraling into depression. But the psychological challenges were mounting. Humans are fundamentally social creatures. We're not designed for complete isolation. David found himself talking out loud, narrating his actions like he was hosting some kind of deranged nature documentary. He had conversations with himself, arguing both sides of debates. Should he stay put or try to find his way out? Was rescue still looking for him or had they given up? He gave names to animals he saw regularly. A toucan that visited his camp every morning became Terry. A tree frog that lived near his shelter was Frank. Anthropomorphizing animals gave him a sense of companionship, however false. The silence between sounds was the worst part. The Amazon is never truly silent, but there are lulls. Moments when the constant background noise drops to almost nothing. In those moments, the isolation was crushing. David thought about his family constantly. His sister Sarah, a lawyer in Denver. His parents, both retired now, living in the same house in Boulder where he'd grown up. Did they know he was missing? Were they organizing their own search? The not knowing was torture. He imagined them getting the phone call. The devastation on their faces. His mother crying. His father trying to stay strong while falling apart inside. These thoughts were both comforting and agonizing. Comforting because thinking about them made him feel less alone. Agonizing because he might never see them again. He thought about food constantly. Not just any food, but specific foods. A burger from his favorite place in Boulder, cooked medium rare with cheddar cheese and bacon. His mother's lasagna, the family recipe she'd learned from her Italian grandmother. Even simple things took on profound significance. A bowl of cereal, a peanut butter sandwich, a cold glass of milk. David had never been particularly focused on food before. He ate to fuel his body. But now, without food, it became an obsession. He dreamed about eating. Vivid, detailed dreams where he could taste everything perfectly. Waking from these dreams was cruel. On day 7, David made a decision. Staying put had been the right choice initially. It gave rescuers the best chance of finding him. But it had been 7 days. No more helicopters had passed overhead after that second day. Either the search had been called off, or they were looking in the wrong area. Waiting was no longer a viable strategy. He needed to save himself. David remembered something Joao, one of the guides, had mentioned during the boat ride to camp. All these small streams and tributaries eventually flow into larger rivers. Rivers mean settlements, villages, river traffic. If he could find a river, he could find people. The stream near his camp was maybe 3 feet wide and 6 inches deep, barely more than a creek. But it was flowing water, and flowing water goes downhill, eventually joining other water. It was a plan. More than that, it was hope. On the morning of day 8, David broke camp. He rolled up his tarp and tied it to his pack. He made sure his remaining supplies were secure. He took one last look at the spot that had been his home for a week, then started following the stream downstream. Walking through the Amazon rainforest is exhausting in a way that's difficult to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not like hiking in other forests. There are no trails. Every single step requires navigating obstacles. Fallen trees block your path constantly. Some are small enough to step over. Others are massive, requiring detours of hundreds of feet to get around. Vines hang from every tree, creating barriers that need to be pushed through or cut. The undergrowth varies from almost nothing to nearly impenetrable walls of ferns and bushes. The ground alternates between ankle-deep mud that sucks at your boots and exposed root systems that create natural tripwires. David could only manage about 1 mile per hour, and that was when conditions were favorable. The heat and humidity were relentless. His clothes were perpetually soaked, whether from sweat, stream crossings, or the constant moisture in the air. His boots, designed for hiking, were falling apart. The constant wetness had rotted the stitching. The soles were coming loose. Each step made a squelching sound. His feet inside were a disaster. Blisters had formed and popped and formed again. The skin between his toes was breaking down, creating painful cracks that oozed fluid. He knew this was the beginning of trench foot, a condition that had plagued soldiers in World War I. If he didn't get medical treatment soon, he could lose toes or worse. The stream meandered constantly, forcing David to follow its curves. Sometimes it disappeared underground for stretches, forcing him to search for where it re-emerged. Other times it split into multiple channels and he had to decide which was the main flow. He made mistakes. Several times he followed a branch that ended in a small pool or disappeared completely, forcing him to backtrack. Each mistake cost him energy and time he couldn't afford to waste. His navigation strategy was simple. Always follow the largest flow of water. When the stream split, he took the channel that seemed to carry the most volume. This logic proved sound. By mid-afternoon on day 8, he noticed the stream was getting wider. What had been 3 feet across that morning was now nearly 6 feet. The water was deeper, flowing faster. More water meant he was heading in the right direction. That first day of walking, David covered maybe 4 miles. It doesn't sound like much, but it represented 8 hours of continuous effort. His legs burned. His shoulders ached from the pack. His injured feet screamed with every step. When he finally stopped for the night, he was utterly exhausted. He set up his tarp shelter near the stream, built a fire, and collapsed. He had no food. His stomach had long since stopped growling. Now it was just a constant hollow ache. He drank water until his belly was full, trying to trick his body into feeling satisfied. It didn't work. He lay in his shelter, listening to the forest, watching his fire, and wondering if he would survive this. For the first time since getting lost, David seriously considered the possibility that he might die out here. The thought was terrifying but also strangely calming. If this was how it ended, at least he'd tried. He'd fought. He hadn't given up. Day 9 started like day 8. Wake at dawn. Drink water. Break camp. Start walking. But within 2 hours, disaster struck. David was crossing a particularly muddy section near the stream. The bank was steep, maybe 4 feet high. He'd already crossed dozens of similar spots, using roots and branches to climb up and down. This time his boots slipped. The rotten sole that had been coming loose finally gave way completely. David's foot shot out from under him. He fell hard, his full weight coming down on his left ankle at an awkward angle. The pain was immediate and excruciating. He heard something pop, felt something give way. He lay in the mud, water from the stream soaking him, and knew immediately this was bad. David forced himself to sit up and examine his ankle. It was already swelling. Within minutes, it had doubled in size. Moving it produced waves of pain that made his vision blur. He'd either severely sprained it or fractured it. Either way, he was now dealing with a mobility problem in addition to everything else. David wanted to scream in frustration, wanted to pound his fists in the mud, wanted to give up. But giving up meant dying, and he wasn't ready for that. He cut a straight branch from a nearby tree using his knife. The branch was about 4 feet long and reasonably straight. He tested it as a walking stick. Would work. He fashioned a crude wrap for his ankle using strips torn from his spare shirt, trying to provide some support and compression. Then he forced himself to stand. The pain when he put weight on his left foot was incredible. David bit down on his belt to keep from screaming. But he could walk. It was a limping, painful shuffle, but it was movement. He continued following the stream. His pace, already slow, now dropped to maybe half a mile per hour. Every step on his injured ankle sent fresh waves of pain radiating up his leg. He had to stop frequently to rest. What should have been a 6-hour day of walking took 12. He covered 3 miles total. 3 agonizing miles that felt like 30. That night was perhaps his lowest point. Sitting by his fire, his ankle throbbing, his body wasting away from lack of food, his feet destroyed, his spirit nearly broken, David came as close as he ever would to truly giving up. He thought about how easy it would be to just lie down and let nature take its course. The Amazon would reclaim his body within days. Insects, bacteria, fungi, animals. Within a week there would be nothing left but bones. Within a month even those would be scattered. He'd become part of the forest, his atoms recycled into new life. There was a strange peace in that thought. But then he thought about his family. About his sister Sarah, who'd looked up to him her whole life. About his parents, who'd supported every crazy dream he'd ever had. About the people who cared about him, who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened, where he was, whether he'd suffered. That thought brought him back. He couldn't do that to them. He had to survive. Not for himself, but for the people who loved him. Day 10 began with new resolve. David's ankle was a disaster. Purple bruising spread up his calf. The swelling hadn't gone down at all despite keeping it elevated overnight. But he could still walk on it, barely. He broke camp and continued downstream. The stream was noticeably wider now, maybe 12 feet across in most places. The water was deeper, too deep to wade without getting completely soaked. This was progress. Bigger water meant he was getting close to something. He just had to keep moving. Around mid-morning, David heard something that made his heart race. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the normal jungle sounds. But it was definitely there. The sound of an engine. A boat engine. David pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain in his ankle. The sound faded, then returned. It was coming from ahead of him, from downstream. He was getting close to a river. Close to civilization. Close to rescue. The knowledge gave him energy he didn't know he still had. He moved faster, using his walking stick to take weight off his injured ankle. By noon, the character of the forest was changing. The canopy was thinning. More light reached the ground. The vegetation was different, more palms and less dense undergrowth. These were signs of proximity to a major waterway. Rivers create their own ecosystems, and David was entering that zone. The stream he'd been following was now 20 feet wide and too deep to see the bottom. It was barely a stream anymore. This was a small river in its own right. And then around a bend, David saw it. Open sky. The first time he'd seen actual open sky in 10 days. The stream emptied into a river that had to be at least 150 feet wide. Brown water moved swiftly, carrying debris and sediment from upstream. This was a real river, the kind that appeared on maps, the kind that people used for transportation. David emerged from the forest onto a muddy bank. The openness was overwhelming after 10 days under the canopy. He could see the sky, clouds, the sun bright and harsh. The far bank of the river was maybe 200 feet away. And there, in the distance, moving downriver, was a boat. A real boat with people in it. David screamed. His voice, already hoarse from days of shouting, cracked and broke. He waved his arms. Used his camera flash even though he knew it was useless in daylight. The boat was too far away. They couldn't hear him over the engine. They couldn't see him against the background of vegetation. The boat disappeared around a bend in the river. David sat down heavily on the mud. But this time he didn't despair. Where there was one boat, there would be others. He just needed to make himself visible. David spent the afternoon preparing. He cleared a space on the bank, cutting down smaller vegetation to create an obvious clearing. He gathered every piece of dry wood and green plant material he could find. He built the biggest fire he'd ever made, piling on green leaves and wet moss to create thick white smoke. The smoke rose in a column that had to be visible for miles. He positioned himself where he could see both directions on the river. And he waited. Hours passed. The sun crossed the sky, beginning its descent toward the western horizon. David kept the fire going, adding material whenever the smoke thinned. He rehearsed what he'd say when someone finally came. Practiced waving, shouting, signaling. He couldn't miss this chance. At approximately 5:30 p.m., David heard another engine. This one was coming upriver, heading in his direction. He threw everything he had left onto the fire. Green palm fronds. Wet leaves. The smoke billowed thick and white against the darkening sky. He stood at the water's edge and waved his bright blue tarp over his head like a flag. He screamed until his throat bled. The engine sound grew louder. And then he saw it. A small boat with an outboard motor rounding the bend about a quarter-mile downriver. Two men were visible in the boat. They were looking at something on the far bank. They hadn't seen him yet. David waved the tarp frantically. Screamed. used his whistle, blowing until he saw spots in his vision. One of the men pointed toward his fire. The boat changed course. It was coming toward him. The boat approached cautiously. The two men were clearly uncertain about what they were seeing. David looked more like a forest spirit than a human. He'd lost nearly 30 pounds. His beard was wild and matted. His clothes were in rags. His skin was covered in mud, scratches, insect bites, and infections. His left ankle was grotesquely swollen. He was barefoot, his destroyed boots having been abandoned 2 days earlier. He probably looked like he'd been in the jungle for months, not 10 days. The boat pulled up to the bank. The older of the two men, dark-skinned with weathered features, called out something in Portuguese. David didn't speak Portuguese, but he understood the tone. It was a question. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" David tried to answer but found his voice wasn't working properly. His throat was too damaged from shouting and dehydration. What came out was a raspy croak. He gestured to himself, then downstream, trying to communicate that he needed help, that he needed to go with them. The younger man said something to the older one. They were brothers, David would learn later. Miguel was the older one, 48 years old. Rodrigo was younger, 33. They ran a small supply service, transporting goods between river communities. They lived their entire lives on and around these rivers. They'd seen strange things, but this was new even for them. Miguel maneuvered the boat closer to the bank. Rodrigo stood and extended his hand. David waded into the water, not caring that it soaked him yet again. The water was warm and actually felt good on his destroyed feet and swollen ankle. He grabbed Rodrigo's hand and both brothers pulled him into the boat. David collapsed in the bottom, finally allowing himself to believe he was safe. Miguel handed him a bottle of water. David's instinct was to chug it, but Miguel stopped him, making drinking motions slowly. Too much water too fast would make him sick. David sipped carefully, savoring each mouthful more than anything he'd ever tasted. Rodrigo pulled out a small radio and spoke rapidly in Portuguese. David caught a few words that sounded universal. Americano. Perdido. Lost. He was reporting finding a lost American. Within minutes, a response came back, scratchy and distorted but clearly human voices. Civilization. Help. Medical care. It was really over. Miguel offered David a piece of bread from a bag. It was just plain bread, probably a day old, but to David it was the most delicious thing he'd ever eaten. His stomach, empty for days, cramped at the sudden introduction of food. Miguel made him eat slowly, just small bites. Too much too fast would be dangerous after such extended starvation. The boat ride downriver took about 2.5 hours. David drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. The combination of relief, exhaustion, and his body finally allowing itself to shut down made staying awake impossible. He had fragmented memories of the trip, the sound of the motor, the feel of the boat moving beneath him, Miguel and Rodrigo talking quietly in Portuguese, the sun setting, painting the river gold and orange, stars beginning to appear overhead. So many stars, more than he'd ever seen. And then lights on the shore, buildings, people, a village. The village was called São João, a community of maybe 200 people living on the river about 90 miles from Manaus. Someone had radioed ahead, and a crowd was waiting at the dock when they arrived. David was carefully helped out of the boat. People spoke to him in Portuguese and heavily accented English. Someone said, "Doctor is coming." Another voice said, "You are safe now." Children stared at him with wide eyes. An older woman brought a chair, and David sat while they waited for medical help. Someone else brought more water and food. A woman cleaned the worst of the mud and blood from his face with a damp cloth, her touch gentle and maternal. The doctor arrived about 30 minutes later. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s, who trained in Manaus and returned to practice in rural communities. His English was excellent. He introduced himself as Dr. Carvalho and immediately began examining David. He checked vital signs. Blood pressure dangerously low. Heart rate elevated. Severely dehydrated despite the water he'd drunk. Malnourished. The ankle was his primary concern. It was badly fractured, not just sprained. Dr. Carvalho administered pain medication and antibiotics, then arranged for David to be transported to a larger medical facility. The village had a small clinic, but this required more advanced care. Another boat arrived an hour later, this one larger and equipped as a basic ambulance. David was transferred aboard, and they began the journey to a town with a hospital. The trip took 4 hours through the night. David was given 4 fluids to combat dehydration. More antibiotics for the numerous infections covering his body. pain medication that finally dulled the constant ache of his ankle and feet. He slept real sleep for the first time in 10 days. When he woke, they were pulling up to a dock beside a hospital. Lights, concrete buildings, modern medicine, safety. David spent the next 18 hours in the hospital undergoing evaluation and treatment. He was severely malnourished, having lost 32 pounds from his normally lean 175-pound frame. He was dangerously dehydrated despite drinking stream water constantly. Multiple parasitic infections from untreated water. Numerous bacterial infections and cuts and scratches. Advanced trench foot on both feet. The fractured ankle required surgery, which they performed the next day. But overall, considering what he'd been through, David was in remarkably good condition. The human body is incredibly resilient when it has to be. Word spread quickly about the lost photographer found in the Amazon. Dr. Santos and her team, who had returned to Manaus after David went missing, were notified. She came to visit him in the hospital, bringing his passport and personal items that had been left at base camp. She was crying when she saw him, apologizing repeatedly even though none of this was her fault. The search had continued for 5 days. Helicopters, ground teams, local volunteers who knew the forest. They'd covered hundreds of square miles. But the Amazon is vast, and David had walked far from where they'd been searching. They'd been about to officially suspend the search when news came that he'd been found. Dr. Santos helped David contact his family. The phone call to his parents was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. They'd been told 10 days earlier that he was missing in the Amazon. For 10 days, they'd lived with the uncertainty, the fear, the gradual acceptance that he was probably dead. When his mother answered the phone and heard his voice, she sobbed so hard she couldn't speak. His father took the phone, his voice shaking. "We thought we'd lost you," was all he could manage. David assured them he was alive, he was safe, he'd be home soon. His sister Sarah was on a plane to Brazil within hours of hearing the news, determined to be there when he was released from the hospital. The media got hold of the story. Lost photographer survives 12 days in the Amazon. It was the kind of human interest story that captures attention. Reporters called the hospital. News crews showed up. David gave one interview, mainly to satisfy the curiosity and get them to leave him alone. He downplayed his own role, emphasized the importance of the fishermen who'd rescued him, praised the search and rescue teams. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He'd just been trying to survive. After 5 days in the hospital, David was stable enough to be released. Sarah had arrived by then, and she stayed with him in Manaus for another week while he built up strength and waited for medical clearance to fly. His ankle was in a cast. He was on crutches. He'd regained about 8 pounds but still looked gaunt. His skin was healing but covered in scabs and fading bruises. He looked like he'd been through a war, which in a sense he had. A war against nature, against himself, against despair. The flight back to the United States was uncomfortable but uneventful. Sarah stayed beside him the entire time, as if afraid he'd disappear if she looked away. When they landed in Denver, his parents were waiting at the gate. His mother hugged him carefully, mindful of his injuries. His father gripped his shoulder, unable to speak through the tears. They drove him to Boulder, to his childhood home, where he would stay while recovering. The familiarity was overwhelming. The house he'd grown up in. The mountains visible through the kitchen window. Hot water on demand. Soft beds. Abundant food. Things he'd always taken for granted now seemed like impossible luxuries. Physical recovery took months. The fractured ankle healed slowly, requiring physical therapy. The trench foot caused permanent minor nerve damage in his toes. He'd never have quite the same feeling in his feet, always a slight numbness. The parasitic infections required multiple courses of medication. But his body healed. Young, relatively healthy bodies usually do, given time and proper treatment. The psychological recovery was much more difficult. David experienced classic PTSD symptoms. Nightmares about being lost, about dying alone in the forest. Panic attacks triggered by being in enclosed spaces or, ironically, by being alone. The sound of heavy rain would send him into anxiety spirals. Even insects buzzing would sometimes trigger flashbacks. He started therapy with a psychologist specializing in trauma. Twice-a-week sessions that gradually helped him process what had happened. The hardest part was the guilt. Survivor's guilt is common after traumatic experiences, but David's had a specific character. He felt guilty about the cost of the search operation. Guilty about the worry he'd caused his family and friends. Guilty about his mistakes that led to getting lost in the first place. His therapist helped him understand that guilt wasn't productive unless it led to changed behavior. Yes, he'd made mistakes. Yes, people had suffered because of his situation, but he'd also shown remarkable resilience and will to survive. That counted for something. 6 months after his rescue, David was physically recovered enough to return to work. But he'd changed. He no longer felt comfortable working alone in remote environments. The confidence that had been his trademark was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness of risk that bordered on paranoia. His first assignment was photographing wildlife at a nature preserve in Wyoming, close to civilization with cell service and roads. Even that felt overwhelming. He had multiple panic attacks during the 2-week assignment. He began to wonder if his career as a wildlife photographer was over. Maybe he just couldn't do this anymore. It was his sister Sarah who suggested he pivot rather than quit. She pointed out that conservation photography didn't always require going to extreme remote locations. Research stations existed. Protected areas with infrastructure. Organizations that documented conservation work. He could still contribute meaningful work without putting himself in situations that triggered his trauma. David took her advice. He reached out to conservation organizations and research institutions. Found opportunities to document important work from the relative safety of established facilities. His first post-trauma project was working with a reforestation program in Costa Rica. He lived in a field station with electricity, internet, and regular supply runs. He documented the process of forest recovery, the planting efforts, the monitoring of wildlife returning to restored areas. The work was meaningful, the images were powerful, and David never felt the panic he'd experienced in Wyoming. He'd found a way forward. Not the same path he'd been on before, but a valid one that allowed him to continue doing work he believed in. A year after the incident, David began writing about his experience. Not for publication initially, just for himself. A way to process what had happened, to make sense of it, to find meaning in the trauma. But the writing took on a life of its own. It became a manuscript. With encouragement from his therapist and family, he found a literary agent. The agent loved it. Publishers were interested. The book, which David titled 12 Days of Silence, was published 18 months after his rescue. It became an unexpected bestseller. People connected with the story of survival, resilience, and the psychological journey of recovery. David donated a significant portion of the proceeds to Amazon conservation organizations, feeling it was important to give something back to the place that had nearly killed him but had also taught him profound lessons. The book led to speaking engagements. David found himself on stages talking about his experience, about survival psychology, about the Amazon's importance and fragility. He was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but gradually came to see it as an opportunity. If his story could raise awareness about conservation, about preparation, about the power of the human spirit, then perhaps the trauma had purpose. Public speaking became a regular part of his work. He spoke at conservation conferences, outdoor education programs, even corporate events about resilience and overcoming adversity. 3 years after getting lost, David met Elena, a biologist working on forest ecology. She understood his work, his passion for conservation, and his trauma. She didn't try to fix him or push him to be who he was before the Amazon. She accepted who he was now, scars and all. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Boulder with just family and close friends. For the first time since the incident, David felt like he was building a future rather than just recovering from the past. David never returned to that specific area of the Amazon. He's been back to the region several times since, always with proper support and infrastructure, never alone. He's photographed conservation projects along the Amazon basin, documented reforestation efforts, worked with indigenous communities on sustainable development projects. But he's never gone back to that section of primary forest where he spent 12 days lost. Some places, he's decided, are better left in memory. When people ask David what he learned from his ordeal, his answer has evolved over the years. Immediately after, when the trauma was fresh, he talked about practical lessons. The importance of redundant communication devices, better waterproofing, not going anywhere alone in remote environments. But with time and reflection, his answer has deepened. The Amazon taught me humility, he says now. Real humility, not the intellectual kind you can learn from books. I went in there thinking I was prepared, thinking my experience in other extreme environments had taught me enough. The forest showed me how little I actually knew. It stripped away every bit of confidence and ego and left me with just the raw will to survive. That's both terrifying and clarifying. He talks about the psychological aspects more now too. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges, though those were real enough. It was the mental battle. Fighting despair. Fighting the voice in your head that says giving up would be easier. I learned that the human mind is both incredibly fragile and incredibly strong. We can be broken by isolation and fear, but we can also endure things we never imagined we could survive. That knowledge changes you. You can't go through something like that and come out the same person. David also emphasizes the randomness of survival. People want survival stories to have clear lessons. Do X and you'll survive. Avoid Y and you'll die. But the truth is messier. I made mistakes that could have killed me. I also got lucky in ways I didn't earn. Those fishermen could have taken a different route that day. The stream I followed could have led to an isolated oxbow lake instead of a river. 100 things could have gone differently and I'd have died out there. Survival is preparation plus decisions plus luck. You need all three. The experience fundamentally changed David's relationship with nature. He's lost the romantic notion of wilderness as a benign force that welcomes humans. Nature doesn't care about us, he says. It's not hostile, but it's not friendly either. It's indifferent. The Amazon doesn't want to kill you, but it also won't help you survive. Understanding that indifference is crucial. We're visitors in these places, not masters. We survive in wild places only by being smart, prepared, and respectful of forces much larger than ourselves. Perhaps most importantly, David talks about gratitude. I thought I understood gratitude before. I'd say thank you, appreciate things in an abstract way. But after 12 days thinking I might die, after being rescued, after experiencing the generosity of strangers who had no reason to help me, I understand gratitude in my bones now. I'm grateful for things I never noticed before. Hot showers, clean clothes, the ability to walk to a refrigerator and get food, sleeping without fear, being able to contact people I love whenever I want. These aren't small things. These are miracles we take for granted every single day. David's story resonates because it touches something universal. We've all felt lost at some point, even if not literally in a rainforest. We've all faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. We've all wondered if we had the strength to keep going. David's 12 days in the Amazon is an extreme version of struggles we all face. The specifics are unique to him, but the underlying human experiences of fear, determination, despair, hope, and ultimately survival are universal. That's why people connect with his story. It reminds us of our own resilience, our own capacity to endure. Today, David Marchetti continues working as a conservation photographer and advocate. He's published 3 more books since 12 Days of Silence. He teaches workshops on outdoor photography and wilderness safety. He serves on the board of 2 conservation organizations. He and Elena have 2 children now, and David approaches fatherhood with the same intensity he once brought to extreme photography. He's teaching his kids about nature, about respect for wild places, about preparation and safety. But he's also teaching them that life involves risk, and hiding from risk isn't the answer. The goal is to take calculated risks, to push boundaries thoughtfully, to live fully while being smart. The Amazon continues to change. Deforestation rates fluctuate based on politics and economics. Climate change alters rainfall patterns and temperature regimes. Species go extinct while others adapt. The forest David got lost in 10 years ago is both the same and different. Ancient trees that were there during his ordeal still stand. Others have fallen, creating gaps in the canopy where new growth races toward sunlight. The stream he followed still flows, still merges with the river where he was rescued. The forest continues its cycles, indifferent to the human drama that played out within its boundaries. David sometimes wonders about the spot where he built his first shelter, where he spent those initial days hoping for rescue. Has anyone else been there since? Probably not. That section of forest sees human visitors maybe once every several years, if that. The evidence of his presence is long gone. The fire pit has been reclaimed by vegetation. The area where he cleared space for signaling has grown back. Nature erases human presence quickly in the Amazon. Within a week of his leaving, it would have been impossible to tell anyone had been there. Within a month, no trace remained. The forest had absorbed his presence and moved on. There are dozens of similar stories that don't end in rescue. Every year, people get lost in the Amazon. Indigenous hunters who know the forest better than David ever could, but who suffer a medical emergency or injury that prevents them from returning home. Researchers who wander too far from camp. Tourists who ignore warnings and venture beyond safe areas. Pilots whose small planes go down in the jungle. Not all of them make it out. The forest keeps their stories, their remains eventually becoming part of the endless cycle of growth, death, and rebirth that defines the rainforest. David thinks about these others sometimes. The ones who didn't make it. What separated him from them? Was it skill? What? Timing? The honest answer is probably all 3, in proportions impossible to calculate. He could have easily become another missing person, another search that eventually turned into a recovery operation, another family destroyed by uncertainty and loss. That he didn't is something he tries never to forget. Survival isn't guaranteed just because you want it badly enough. But wanting it, fighting for it, refusing to surrender to despair, those things matter. But shift the odds slightly in your favor. Sometimes slightly is enough. The story of David Marchetti lost in the Amazon is ultimately about the intersection of human fragility and human resilience. We are fragile creatures in wild places. Our bodies are not adapted for life in primary rainforest. We don't have the defenses, the instincts, the physical capabilities of animals that evolved there. A jaguar could kill us without effort. Insects carry diseases we can't fight without medicine. Plants produce toxins that sicken or kill us. We are, in most ways, poorly designed for survival in extreme environments. But we have something other animals don't. We have the ability to reason, to plan, to learn from mistakes, to use tools, and perhaps most importantly, to refuse to give up even when every instinct screams at us to surrender. That stubborn human will to survive, that refusal to accept death even when it seems inevitable, is our superpower. The Amazon rainforest will outlast us all, assuming we don't destroy it first through deforestation and climate change. It has existed in various forms for 50 million years. Humans have been around for maybe 300,000 years, and modern civilization for only about 10,000. The forest has seen countless species come and go. We'll see many more. Whether humans are among the survivors remains to be determined, but for now the forest stands. Vast, ancient, powerful, and indifferent to the tiny dramas that play out beneath its canopy. David's 12 days of silence were a footnote in the Amazon's history. But for David, those 12 days were everything. They broke him down and built him back up into someone different. Someone who understands, in a way most people never will, both how fragile and how strong human beings can be.